Well, good morning. It is Wednesday, July 8th. Welcome as we gather in this time of devotions. I am Heather E. Clausen, pastor of Bethel Lutheran Church and the United Methodist Church, both in Herman, Minnesota. This morning we are going to be in the New Testament in the book of Romans, chapter 7, beginning at verse 15. Romans, over the years, has been used in many different ways. Many of you may have grown up thinking and remembering when it was the Roman Road of Salvation, and there was a card that had different verses on it from Romans that were handed out. Yet Romans is not so much for those who do not yet know, who God is speaking to and may not have yet heard. But Romans is a book for those who have already turned, who have heard that voice of God, and who have responded. And Romans is a book that tells us both how we are to live into the footsteps of Jesus, but also is very honest about some of the struggles we face. In our passage this morning, Paul is talking about his own personal struggle, and of course, we will hear in these words the struggle that we have as well. So Romans 7, beginning at verse 15. I do not understand my own actions, for I do not do what I want, but I do the very thing I hate. Now, if I do what I do not want, I agree that the law is good. But in fact, it is no longer that I do it, but the sin that dwells within me. For I know that nothing good dwells within me, that in my flesh I can will what is right, but I cannot do it. For I do not do the good I want, but the evil I do not want is what I do. Now if I do what I do not want, it is no longer I that do it, but the sin that dwells within me. So I find it to be a law that when I want to do what is good, evil lies close at hand. Sounds like life, doesn't it? We can try so hard to do what is right. When Jesus spoke of not abolishing the law but fulfilling the law, he was talking about the embodiment, that the law itself, and of course referring to what was called the Ten Commandments, and as we would hear in Deuteronomy, what Jesus would later say about how we are to be with God and with neighbor. And the law is good. But the law is external. And what Jesus was bringing to the people, to us, of course, down through the generations, is an understanding that the law is much more than that. That it is not just external rules, but it is an embodiment. And that embodiment needs to be in alignment with Jesus Christ. And so what Paul is saying here is not, oh my gosh, I'm always going to fail. But he's speaking to the truth that we cannot do it on our own. Whether you call it the sinful nature, however it is described, when we try to do good on our own, quite often it really doesn't go right. And you know, Jesus talked about a burden of a yoke and said that this yoke was light and my burden was easy. And we go, what? Seriously? But what he was pointing out was this truth that Paul is speaking about, that when we are yoked to Jesus, when we are yoked to one another, the burden does become lighter because we are not on our own. I don't know how many of you over the years have been Family Circus cartoon strip fans, but it's something I grew up with. And it was about these 4 children. And these 4 children were Billy, Dolly, Jeffy, and of course little PJ. But there always were in the background these 2 little shapes of children. And whenever in the comic strip they would be asked if they had done whatever it was that had happened, the question, who did this? Kind of a parental question. There were these 2 shadowy figures that were not those 4 children, apparently, but they were. But these shadowy, I don't know, and not me. And they appeared as transparent outlines in the strip, and, very much visited our home and part of our growing up. Part of growing up and we're learning to take responsibility for our actions and learning to not do some of those things in the first place. When we're children, can we do it on our own? No. We try. But our parents are our guidance. And sometimes in that guidance there is some discipline. And over the years of growing up, it begins to become internal. Internal to know that I cannot do this because it creates harm. Internal to know that I should not do this. And as we internalize that, what we find out is that as we grow into adulthood, we understand that we, even as we are adults, although we think when we're children, everything will be better then, there'll be no problems, we can't do it on our own. And as people of faith, we need that connection. Because if we try to do it on our own, most of the time we will fail. And so as Jesus speaks of this yoke that is light and the burden easy, what he's speaking about is what a yoke actually is. Okay, yoke can do several things. A yoke can link oxen so that together they pull the load, that not one by itself is doing it. There is a yoke that can be worn across the shoulder to carry 2 buckets, often in ancient times, of course, of water, to be carried back. And when we have that, spreading that weight across our shoulders, spread it out and share the work. And that's what Jesus is speaking about. We're doing a lot of reviewing and reflecting. And many people in our world today, we're discovering, have carried a heavier yoke. And their yoke, twinning with God, is to bring about change in the world. I have been rereading, and many people have been reading, a book called White Fragility. And it calls us to be aware that our white privilege is something which we've been raised on, and it's very deeply embedded in our culture. The most well-meaning of us operate out of a racist worldview. And we are being invited to pick up that yoke and to bring about real change. And we're not to do it alone. We know, as Paul says, that we want to do what is right. We want to do what is good. We want to do what is fair. We want to do what is most loving. And yet, when we try to go it on our own, sadly, it becomes about us. And when it becomes about us, it becomes something different than what God intends. Because it can trick us into imagining that we can perfectly do God's will all by ourselves, and then find ourselves thinking it's on our own power. And if it's on our own power, then looking down on others who are struggling. And that is not the intention of Jesus. And that right there shows that when we try under our own power, we will be deluded. And that's what sin does. To be free, as Jesus intends, means we don't do it alone. Jesus is part of that work together and calls us together as people to work together on what's going on in society, on the social justice, the equality that God intends for all people. In a time of illness, that all will receive the care that they need, the testing that they need, all that they need moving forward to not just protect life, but to live life. And so Paul states a truth, and he's being very vulnerable. He's a religious leader. He's one of the missionaries. He's one of the ones that they look to hear about Jesus, to understand the difference in what Jesus showed than what was practiced in their world. To let them know a God that was a God of love and was with them in all things. And Paul is vulnerable enough to state before the people that he is teaching, the people that he is sharing faith with and life with, he is vulnerable enough to say, I don't get it right. I struggle all the time. And I struggle the most when I try to do it on my own. And so this morning our word from Romans is a reminder. We're not intended to do it on our own. When we do it on our own, we tend to forget to partner with God. And when we try to do it on our own, it isn't done rightly. And it becomes, as I said earlier, more about us than it is about God's intention. And so today, let us be honest, just like Paul. We can't get it right on our own. We need Jesus to help us to hear more clearly, to see more clearly, to love more clearly. And also, we need one another. Today, as you go forth from this time, remember these words of Paul. We're not intended to do it on our own. But we are intended to turn to Jesus, to support one another, and to be sure the agenda in our lives moving forward is God's, the one we see in Jesus. Go in peace. Amen.